Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee. On a week that's seen the French government fall in a vote of no confidence, Prime Minister Michel Barnier given the boot over the budget and setting a record for the briefest stint in office. The Constitution states there can't be new elections until next summer, so whoever takes charge must keep on limping on.
We can't afford to be divided, and we can't afford to stand still. This is why I will be appointing a Prime Minister in the next few days. I will give them the task of forming a government in the common interest, representing all the political forces of a narco-government.
It's been a week that's seen special forces deployed to the South Korean parliament. We saw helicopters landing on the roof after a late-night shock announcement by President Yoon declaring martial law. Lawmakers cried foul, gathered enough votes to overturn it, and after a standoff that lasted 6 hours, the president rescinded the measure. He's now facing impeachment, possibly treason charges. We look at why he acted, why it failed, and what next.
I declare martial law to protect the Free Republic of Korea from the threat of North Korean communist forces, to eradicate the despicable pro-North Korean anti-state forces that are plundering the freedom and happiness of our people, and to protect the free constitutional order.
And it's a week that's seen Christmas festivities in full swing in much of the world. But if there's an award for the most underwhelming light switch on of 2024, then this must be a strong contender. What the Daily Express described as, quote, toe-curlingly awkward, this was the Keir Starmer countdown in Downing Street.
Could you please join me when I say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yay! It worked. Nervous moment there, but it's all good.
Alongside me on the panel this week, Vivian Wald, globe-trotting correspondent for Time Magazine, Fortune, the New York Times Dealbook 2, and on the board of the Overseas Press Club America. Vivian, fantastic to have you with us as always. Tell us about your week.
My week's been kind of an interesting one. Inside Notre-Dame a couple of days ago and writing about
you
Notre-Dame.
Name dropper.
Yes, name dropper.
Come on, what was it like?
Well, it's interesting. I kind of did a story years ago about how Notre-Dame was falling apart. And it was actually on the basis of that article that they went to the US and raised money to do some of the repairs. So in fact, I am indirectly responsible for this fire because it was during those repairs, of course, that the fire happened. But
you're still invited to the main weekend celebrations, though, so it's not personal.
Exactly. I will be there inside the cathedral tomorrow, and it's an interesting transformation. I'm not sure what I feel about it, somewhat ambivalent about its new look.
Well, you tease us with a cliffhanger. As we start to talk about it, I'm going to break into that diplomatic language of interesting to see what you really think. Also, Bozu Deragahi, long-time international correspondent, 3-time Pulitzer Prize nominee, based between Paris and Istanbul. Good to see you, Bozu.
It's been a pleasure.
Tell us about what you've been working on or what you've been following for the past few days.
I guess we'll talk about it later, but I think the really extraordinary story that is still ongoing is Syria. And, what's happening there is just, incredible after all these years of stasis and a frozen conflict, this dynamism that very, very few people expected.
We were just talking a short while ago to Robert Ford, former US ambassador to Syria, who said this is unprecedented what we're seeing right now, the scale of the movement. We're just showing, while you were speaking, your article from 2 years ago as well for The Independent, where you spent some time with HTS, this Islamist group.
Yeah, I mean, they let me see what they wanted me to see. So, I mean, and they were, to go into Idlib province, which is under the control of this group. You are basically guests of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this organization. So, it's really, really interesting. We can talk about that.
We're going to get into that and a very slick media operation that they've got as well, Bozu. Great to have you here. Dave Clark, Paris correspondent for Agence France Presse, previously in Brussels. Before that, you've covered many deployments, many conflict zones around the world. What's the story that's perhaps most gripped you, most surprised you this week?
Well, there's been a new one every day. So if any of them you don't like, then South Korea's sorted itself out now. So let's go then find out what's going on in Syria. I landed back from Nigeria on Sunday, and I was just spent a month in Lagos, and that was a nostalgic trip for me. I used to live there, and it was fascinating to see. Mainly just lots more Nigerians. Half of the Nigerians alive today weren't born last time I was there. So
Wow. And you also need to, for anybody who hasn't been to Nigeria or to Lagos or Abuja, you kind of have to prepare yourself for arriving at Lagos Airport, don't you?
it's a bit smoother than it was, but principally...
No, I just mean as soon as you arrive,
Oh, yeah.
you know you're somewhere else.
Yeah, yes.
It's
yes.
busy, it's packed, it's chaotic.
It's chaotic, yeah. But it's friendly. And it's there's a certain amount of hassle. But compared to the previous time, though, there's almost hardly any traffic on the roads. And Lagos is famous for its traffic jams. All the local art depicts huge queues of minibuses. But they have abandoned the petrol subsidy, and no one can afford to run their cars.
Wow.
So push bikes like in Paris.
Is this an urban myth? Every time I used to travel by car in Lagos, somebody would say to me, a friend or a colleague, watch out for watermelons or fruit in the road because somebody will put a spike or a knife in there to puncture the tyre and you could get robbed. Now, I never saw this happen, but everybody told me it had happened in the past. Is this true or fake news?
I've never seen a watermelon in Nigeria.
Okay, well,
and I'm not sure whether wasting fruit would be a good way to start. If you want to commit crimes in Nigeria, you can be a bit more direct.
There are smarter ways to do it.
Yeah. Local government tax collectors put planks with nails in them to stop your cars.
There we go. Fact checked already. That's why you're here, Dave Clark for AFP. Great to have you on board. Also, let's go to London because we have with us Nico Hines. Now, the news director for Daily Beast, formerly of London, the bureau chief for Newsweek and Washington, D.C. For The Times. Nico, I've noticed the Daily Beast has started Trumpland as a category all of its own on the website, such as the journalistic gift that keeps on giving and everyone working around the clock for it. Tell us about that and what you've been focusing on this week, Nico.
Yeah, well, it has to be said we have been focusing on Trump rather a lot over the last few months, and we've now been, I'm not sure what the word is, sentenced to another 4 years of covering Trump. I probably shouldn't share this, but one colleague who's been working with us has actually quit and retired from journalism because she couldn't face another 4 years of covering Trump, and I can kind of see where she's coming from.
Wow. I was asking Dave, I'm going to ask you the similar question, Nico. Anything that surprised you, shocked you, gripped you this week? It's been a very busy week of breaking news.
Yeah, I mean, it's been fantastic in terms of keeping us on our toes, and at least we've moved on from the US election dominating everything. I mean, I think the story of the week from my point of view has been this shooting in New York. You know, the CEO of the world's biggest health insurance company being gunned down outside an expensive hotel in Manhattan. Is just absolutely stunning. And you see these pictures. We've now got images of the guy's face, this kind of smiling assassin, and the guessing and the mystery over what prompted him to do it and the manhunt for him. It's a fascinating one that I think is going to be keeping us on the edge of our seats for the next few days.
And these three odd words that seem to be on the shelling of the shells of the bullet casings, is that right?
Yeah, it's fascinating actually because it's obviously a reference to a book which was called Delay. What was it? Delay, Dispute, and I can't remember the exact wording that the book was. But he. That's right, but he'd actually changed the wording very slightly on the casings to say the third one to be depose, which I don't know, but seems to me a clue as to what's happened. So whether this guy has been deposed by the healthcare companies or whether he was involved in some sort of court case that involved a deposition, we don't know yet, but I feel like that's got to be a clue, the way he's kind of subtly changed the title of this book, which was all about how these health insurance companies screw people over. So it obviously suggests that there's some sort of grudge there in terms of the kind of political or at least the insurance positions taken by these huge companies would be the favourite for the motive, but we don't quite know. But it's going to be fascinating to see how that depose clue kind of gives us further evidence as to what's actually happened personally to this guy to potentially make him do such a crazy act.
Yeah, it is a weird story. Nico, great to have you on board. And we'll start with events here in France. Monday morning, the front page of Libération had a forecast in its own way of the political storm brewing here this week. This was the image of the Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, in his hands the French budget, one that was seeking 60 billion euros of savings. The left and right ring of Parliament would surely vote it down. They had made it clear, but his nuclear option was known as 49.3. It's the article in the Constitution that pushes through the bill, through the National Assembly, without a vote. Would he resort to that? Oh, yes, he did. What would happen if he did? Well, 49.3, 2, 1, gone. It was Marine Le Pen who made a clear and pivotal support and backing she supplied that he relied on to keep the minority government afloat. Well, she would call a vote of no confidence. So too did the left. By Wednesday evening, the confidence vote took place. He was voted out.
60 billion euros in interest. That's what the French will have to pay every year. 60 billion in interest. I would have preferred to give away money, even though we do not have it, to make things and the discussions easier. But that reality remains. Listen to me closely. That reality will not disappear by magic with a motion of no confidence.
Resignation handed in Thursday morning. So what now? In some form or other, the government must keep on limping on till next July. Elections can't be called until then. President Macron, in a TV address to the nation Thursday night, said the option of his resignation to bring about fresh presidential elections was not happening. He claimed his opponents chose chaos. They weren't thinking, he said, about the electorate. It was a new era and time for a rebuild.
Wherever the nation is vulnerable, it needs to be rebuilt. Wherever there is poor behavior, bring wisdom, and wherever there is division, bring unity. Wherever some give in to anguish, bring hope. We have done it, and we will continue to show that to the world.
So another new Prime Minister announced in days. Michel Barnier, the oldest ever to take the job at 73, now makes history a second time. The briefest stint as French Prime Minister, just 3 months. Vivian, at least he lasted longer than the ex-British Prime Minister Liz Truss. If you remember, famously, she was outlasted by a lettuce. I would ask you this. When historians look back, here she is, here's the lettuce. The lettuce lasted, I believe, for a long time for a lettuce, more than 2 months. She lasted just over 40 days. Viv, when historians look back at 2024, they look at the fall of 3 French prime ministers, a year that's seen an end in a pretty chaotic way. What do you think it boils down to?
I think there are a couple of things. One is, this is a crisis somewhat of the president's making. It's Macron who called a snap election. He has picked, you might say, a succession of problematic prime ministers. Probably Gabriel Attal was his best pick, and he chose to effectively end his career by calling the snap election in June. So he really is not a very good chess player, it's turning out to be. And his opponents are very good chess players, particularly Marine Le Pen. So I think there's another issue, which is that there are certain really intractable divides in this country. And for too long, there have been kind of issues upon which different factions have fought this sort of unwinnable argument. We will not raise the retirement age, even though, life expectancy is way higher than it used to be. We will not give in to budget cuts, even though the country is deep in debt. There are sort of some realities that people simply won't wrap their heads around. And it's going to take a very tough leader, a very canny leader, somebody smarter than Macron possibly, to actually bring different factions together and say, you have to sort this out. It's not like these issues are going to magically go away.
It's not going to magically go away, as Vivian says, Bozu, but we kind of saw this coming down the line. There was talk, there was some hope that it could be averted because the budget was seen as, Vivian said, it was such a big issue. Were you surprised it's come to this?
No, not at all. I mean, if anyone was listening to Macron's comments, it's empty comments from an empty suit, representing really a center that is not holding anymore in French or European or Western politics, and just clinging to this post-war ideal of political neoliberalism that is completely has no more constituency anymore. It's the left and the right basically taking this down, showing the bankruptcy of Macron's, I don't even know if you can call it an ideology at this point. Yes, France has serious problems that it needs to address, but he doesn't have the credibility to address them. You need someone who is, you needed, as they say in the US, you needed Nixon to go to China, and you need someone with credibility with ordinary people who's not an empty suit, who's not just some neoliberal patsy for big corporations, making these tough decisions and speaking to people in a way that's not just pablum.
So in your view, a reset, a new era, is actually not just finding a new prime minister, it's finding a new president.
It's happening. I mean, it's happening in French society. It's happening. Look, the reality of France is so different than the one that the political elite and the ones in the grande école adhere to and still stick to. That is collapsing very quickly before our eyes. And it's happening on the outskirts of Paris. You have to leave the 20 arrondissements, and you'll see that it's changing.
Dave, listening, very interesting listening to Boris. One point that
I came in from Montreuil today. I'm from the banlieue.
You're from the suburbs on the outside. Okay. Well, you have a different perspective and one that is equally valid. I'll say to you this: President Macron said, "I would admit my own responsibility to a degree," he said, "but there are those pointing the finger at me who don't accept theirs." And there was an implication that he was talking about his political enemy, Marine Le Pen, and the fact that her tacit support being withdrawn. She kept appearing to move the red lines for Michel Barnier over the budget, even though he was saying, "I will give you some concessions." She says it wasn't, but there are a lot of critics who say this was political expedience for her. This wasn't for the better of the people. This was for her own political good.
Well, at the moment, she's still an opposition party, and that's what she's good at. So trying to trap her into becoming part of the government, I think, was one of the options that Macron had when he made his crazy play and dissolved the parliament. It's an idea that's been tried in other parts of Europe. It's never worked. I don't see if I were Marine Le Pen, why I'd want to tie myself to Michel Barnier's austerity program. It'll be deeply unpopular with my voters, and just got to wait until the next election comes around, and she'll have a bigger, more of a chance of leading a government of her own.
That's a question in itself, Nico, though, isn't it, that Dave raises, waiting till the next election comes around, because there are a number of analysts that would say that Marine Le Pen brought this about earlier because of her own political situation, her own legal situation, because she faces allegations of money disappearing from the European Parliament, to which, if she's found guilty, basically misuse of funds, she could be essentially out of the running for the elections in 2027. That case is something that comes up, I think, early next year, March.
Of a realistic political career, which is a kind of another twist in this absolutely chaotic scene that's happening in Paris. I mean, it's interesting listening to what Boz is saying, and perhaps that will turn out to be the case, but equally, it's so unpredictable. Because you look at the way that Mélenchon and Le Pen are kind of behaving at the moment, and it's an interesting question as to whether either of them is going to be able to unite some great majority in the country, whether the voters are going to thank these politicians for making the running of the country so chaotic. It's all very well bringing down the government, but if you keep doing it every few months, as we've learnt over in Britain, where the Conservative Party kind of kept tearing itself kept tearing itself down, kept kicking out prime ministers, and it ends up being that whoever has been responsible for pulling down the latest one ends up attracting quite a lot of anger and frustration from the population. So it's going to be absolutely fascinating to see who gets the blame as we kind of head into the next round of elections, which everyone hopes will kind of give us a clear answer, but probably will just result in yet more chaos.
More chaos, Vivian. The other question is going to be solved soon is who's going to be the next Prime Minister. And is it a job that people will be queuing at the door for? Because ultimately, yes, you get the perks, but you also get the slings and arrows from now until July. Who's your thought on where we go next?
Well, several names have been kicked around, but your question is a good one. Who wants this job? I mean, there have been 3 kicked out within 12 months. You are the person who takes all the blame.
3 pensions.
Pardon?
3
Oh, yeah,
ministerial
true.
pensions.
That's true.
And a chauffeur.
Yes. There's some good perks. Matignon's pretty nice, too.
It's comfortable.
But, you get all the blame for everything that goes wrong, and surely there will be plenty that does go wrong. You have a lame duck president, and just as Borju says, this is a very divided country that is run by a small clique, really, of people who are increasingly disconnected from the bulk of this country. You don't have to travel, actually, outside the 20 arrondissements of Paris to even notice that. So I think for a prime minister to come in and push through Macron's agenda is going to be extremely difficult, no matter who he chooses.
Borju, a word on Michel Barnier, former Brexit negotiator, career long with a political, a political sort of entrenchment, I guess, in the French fabric of life. This was his moment. His famous catchphrase was "the clock is ticking" during his Brexit days, kind of Captain Hook, Peter Pan style. His clock, well and truly now over 3 months. He was very popular at first. How do you think he will be remembered as Prime Minister, if he will be remembered?
I don't think he will be. I mean, I think that his legacy as a politician, par excellence, kind of, the kind of pan-European politician will be much more memorable than his short stint as a failed Prime Minister. But I would defer to Vivian.
Did you like his
He
style?
also saved the Albertville Winter Games. I mean, that was a fair while back, but
yes,
that was a big win for him. He should have gone out on a high.
I mean, it's really frustrating to kind of witness this, because what this country really is crying out for is some inspirational leader. And right now, the only person who vaguely fits that bill is a right-wing populist. It's kind of maddening to see this year in and year out.
Nico, we've got France in political limbo, Germany in a creek without the proverbial as well right now. Olaf Scholz limping on ahead of elections early next year. The old engine of Europe that's spluttering on. The old question, the old Kissinger question, who does America call when it needs to call Europe? What's the answer now?
It's a very good question. I mean, I think what we're going to see over the next few days gives us the best answer to that, which is that Macron is making efforts to cozy up to Donald Trump ahead of the new administration, which was obviously coming in January in the US. And I think he will get credit for that. Trump's going to come over for the Notre-Dame official opening, and I think that's very significant because there's going to be a race, not so much in Washington to think who are we going to call, but the capitals and the leaders in Europe are going to be fighting amongst themselves to try and build a relationship with Trump. I mean, Scholz and Starmer don't seem to have the first idea about how they're going to build up any rapport with this guy. But Macron does have a kind of little buddy relationship going on there with Trump. There were ups and downs over the last term, but at least there was a sense of comradeship between them. And I think that's clearly why Macron has invited Trump over to Paris. He wants to be the link man. The trouble is he going to have any power to enforce anything over in Europe once he has got the word from the White House?
Well, you've been the perfect link man to talk us through to our next issue, which is Notre-Dame itself, because as the president ended his address to the nation Thursday night, he tried to catch the spirit of the Olympic Games, the reopening of Notre-Dame too this weekend. He spoke of, quote, the need to rebuild where the country was vulnerable, and that after the cathedral fire 5 years ago, France, he said, knows how to do great things to get back on its feet, although he hasn't got 5 years. As we talked about, there are 3 left. But in the years since the fire, the political instability is barely a breath in the long life of Notre Dame that goes back 9 centuries to the Middle Ages. The surviving bell, aptly named Emmanuel, dates back to the days of the Sun King, Louis XIV. Joan of Arc, beatified there. The coronation of Napoleon played out 220 years ago this week. And Charles de Gaulle came here during the liberation of Paris in 1944, surviving sniper fire as he entered. So this weekend's reopening has become a must-see or a must-be-at for world leaders who can say they were there for the bounce-back of Notre-Dame. There'll be no President Biden, but President-elect Trump has told his social media followers it is a special moment he is not going to miss. And remember, 5 years ago, he was president and he was chipping in with this advice to say, so horrible to watch, perhaps flying water tankers could be used to put it out. Must act quickly. So, with Trump in town, a spectacle within a spectacle. Vivian.
Yeah, of course, nobody ever thought of fighting fire with water. It's like they needed Donald Trump to come up with that idea. Yeah. Anyway, I was in Notre-Dame a couple of days ago. Very luckily was among a few journalists that were invited in for a sneak preview, guided around by the head of the rebuilding project. And, the workers, everybody who's worked on this project is hugely emotional. You talk to any of them and they're, in tears. It's been an intense experience for them. Aesthetically, I have to say, maybe this is a terrible thing to say, I kind of preferred it before. You walked in, Notre Dame was always gloomy and sort of dark. And, you could feel the sense that this was 850 years old, that this place had survived the plague, let alone, the French Revolution and everything else. And there really was that kind of atmosphere now. Now it's a kind of shiny as a new penny. It's spectacular. It's an amazing architectural and artisanal accomplishment. And it'll draw millions of visitors, but it's lost its kind of medieval spirit a little bit. It's
photographable, it's Instagrammable, it's very bright. It's very interesting because I was listening to some of the staff, some of the team that have been working on it, saying the luminosity, it's different on the camera to how you see inside. But you're saying actually you kind of felt the same. It was different in a way that didn't quite work for you.
Very much. I mean, they've installed, you can see just, thousands of these bulbs, hidden behind columns and so on. We actually interviewed the guy that was the architect of all the lighting. The lighting will change depending on the weather and the time of the day and so on. It was a very bright, sunny day on Wednesday, and when you walked in, it was kind of a shock visually. So we'll have to see how people get used to it.
Dave, do you like it? What you've seen so far?
Well, I guess it was built that colour. And the medieval...
the creams, the washed walls...
the medieval colours that we associate with it are just the build-up of soot over 850 years. So it's probably closer to the architect's vision. And what struck me about it is the extent to which this is a national project for France. This is about French history, and it's about, and a lot of the people who visited are representatives of the Republic, which is a secular republic, and it's a working Catholic church. It looks less so now that it's been cleaned up, but that's probably because we wrongly associate churches with elderly buildings because they were built a long time ago. It is fascinating as a British person. I come from a country with an established church and where our monarchs are crowned. to see France falling over itself, and it was genuine emotion. Our French people were genuinely shocked when it was on fire, and as Vivian says, the people who've been involved in rebuilding it have been extremely passionate. But it feels like a project for La France. It doesn't feel like something that the Pope was involved in at all.
Well, it's a group of about 2,000 people rebuilding it, stonemasons, craftsmen, they call them the companions of duty, about 2,000 people, the best craftsmen from all over the world. The other thing, Bozo, Trump is in town. A cat amongst the pigeons in some respects, unpredictability factor. When you are watching events this weekend, what are you looking out for?
I mean, I'm sure there'll be a lot of security. I'm going to avoid it. But I mean, what has been really fascinating to me watching this over the last 5 years and watching it quite closely, because I'm often in Ile Saint-Louis, which is right next to the Notre-Dame, is what I would call like the Emily in Paris angle. You know, just the way and the brilliant way and the really smart way the French have marketed the rebuilding of the Notre-Dame and branded it and set up stands and viewing stands. You know, I think they probably made more money off of the rebuilding of the Notre-Dame than they did, you know, in terms of the sales and the visitors and so on. It really has, you know, I mean, Notre-Dame was always, you know, since the time of, you know, Victor Hugo, has been a very prominent, iconic building. But, you know, since the fire and the reconstruction, there's this sort of drama, the documentaries, the you know, National Geographic teams of filming this thing. It's been a big boost for Paris tourism.
We're going to have a special programme tomorrow. You are welcome to watch, Bozo. You are going to be part of it as well. That's tomorrow at 6 p.m. Now, attention and coverage of the Middle East this week was focused on Lebanon. And on Wednesday, 26th of November, a truce was agreed with Israel and Hamas. Well, last Saturday in the early hours, international reports came through that opposition groups opposed to the Assad regime in Syria had captured the second city. Opposition fighters posting updates from inside Aleppo via social media, an advance that's continued despite airstrikes from Syrian and Russian fighter jets in the city that are also injuring and killing civilians. Reports by Thursday that its fighters had moved 70 kilometres south of Aleppo, capturing Hama, where the government forces said they'd withdrawn, quote, out of safety for civilians. And now, as of Friday, we're hearing about the road to Damascus, with rebels literally being on it, taking, or at least claiming to be close to, the third city of Homs. So many questions about this conflict that's essentially been frozen for 4 years. Devastating war that's killed more than 350,000 people, according to the UN, suddenly being reignited. Well, the advance continued despite airstrikes from Syria and Russian fighter jets. I want to start with your thoughts, Bozo, because this is something that you've closely followed and you've spent time with this Islamist group, HTS. Yeah,
I mean, I guess that the events really bolster the argument that many have had that the Assad regime is extremely unpopular, propped up by Russia and Iran and its allied militias, especially Hezbollah, and that, you know, as soon as the moment Russia is distracted, obviously, by Ukraine, and, you know, Iran is distracted by its conflict with Israel, and Hezbollah has been weakened by Israel. The moment that there was a chance, the rebels just rolled on into Aleppo. I don't think they gave up. There was not much of a fight on the ground. And, you know, there's not a lot of people rallying behind the Assad regime. This was a brutal, corrupt, and cruel regime that is in power thanks to force and fear. And, you know, they're taking over. As to the people who are taking over, they are Islamic radicals. They are fundamentalists. But having spent, and I'm not, I abhor certain aspects of the ideology, having spent significant time in the milieu of these groups in northern and northwestern Syria, I would just say that the atmosphere that they created is not much different than the atmosphere you would find in the rural stretches of many Arab countries right now. And that's, you know, the same kind of Islamic fundamentalism pervades in Idlib as I've sensed in rural provinces of Egypt and definitely Libya, for example.
That's very interesting.
I don't think it's that far out. In practice, it's not that far out of the mainstream.
I was seeing on your Twitter account some of the tweets of Christians living in Aleppo giving accounts to reporters saying that, you know, they're not being harmed in the city. It's worth saying a couple of things. So HTS have a very slick media operation right now. I think that its leader, Abu Mohammed al-Julani, former leader of the Nusra Front, which was a splinter group.
Formerly a founder of ISIS, actually.
But then fought against ISIS.
Split and fought against ISIS, exactly.
So he's been doing these slick videos where he's on the phone to somebody, apparently on the front line, where he says, don't harm civilians. So he's giving this apparent, perhaps there's more to it than that, but he says this is not a jihadist group. What do you make of that?
I think that is not necessarily true. There's a few problematic definitions there, but I would just say one thing that I realized about HTS. They're not going to come into someone's bedroom. They're not really concerned about that. They don't want to fight against Christians or Jews even. They're the kind of what they are opposed to. And it's really problematic, is any kind of political plurality. And that is the real issue that you're going to see. Are they going to be able to tolerate an opposition? We'll see.
Vivian, you've looked and spent a lot of time travelling and looking at the other players in this over the years. You have Turkey. You have a statement on Friday from President Erdogan saying that we'll see how far the advance goes, but he doesn't want to see anybody harmed. Very odd sort of quote, which is kind of not clearly saying that you're part of it, but you're not saying stop to the rebels. And then you have the Iranians and the Russians in the mix. There's this geopolitical fracturing, which could really change not just the front lines, but the whole map of Syria.
Absolutely. And just don't forget, you also have, as a kind of background soundtrack, if you like, the whole question over NATO. I mean, you have Turkey as a major player, but you also have whole questions about whether or not, Trump is going to try pull the US out of NATO. Trump, who insisted on pulling US troops out of Syria just 5 years ago, and clearly just couldn't do it, and then did it. And he's always basically regarded Syria as a kind of useless place to spend any attention or resources on. What really strikes me here is just how quickly things can change. Trump he's 6 weeks away from being inaugurated. He thinks he's going to have to deal with Gaza and Ukraine. In fact, he might need to deal with Syria, Turkey. We don't know. These things are changing very quickly. And I think what Borzu says is exactly right, that it's like the emperor with no clothes. You have these regimes which appear on the surface to be all powerful and have a grip on power, but in fact, when you give them big shove, they kind of fall apart. And that's things could be very volatile.
Well, especially with the effect of what we're seeing from the degrading of Hezbollah in Syria from Israel. It's very interesting, Dave, because you've spent time in the region as well over the years. I'm interested in the talk about the possible collapse of the Assad regime. What's your understanding of how close that could be?
Well, I mean, in one sense, you could say it's collapsed now. It doesn't have anywhere close to a majority, never mind a monopoly on violence in the country. It hasn't had, it's been a civil war for a decade. But there is still an organised Assad-led government in Damascus. The people I've been speaking to today, because this was meant to be my day off, but this has not been a week for days off. I was dragged off the street into headquarters today. So the people I've been speaking to today have said that the next city to fall, Homs, if it does, will be very important, because that will
Lebanon.
Yeah, that will. It's getting close to the Lebanese border, and it will cut off Damascus, at least in terms of Syrian territory, cut off Damascus from the coast, from the Mediterranean, and obviously the highlands along the coast are where the Alawite minority lives, and the Russians have a port there. So if the capital is cut off from the Russian port in Tartus and from Assad's political base, then is there a Syrian regime to speak of?
He's moving that fast. Well, it takes us to the other big issue this week. Tuesday night, 10:30, South Korea State News Agency Yonhap sending out an alert. Breaking news, it said. President Yoon has declared martial law. Minutes later, the president was live, addressing the nation, talking of communist threats from North Korea, threats to the state that would mean banning all political parties, severely curbing media freedom. This is what he said.
I declare martial law to protect the Free Republic of Korea from the threat of North Korean communist forces, to eradicate the despicable pro-North Korean anti-state forces that are plundering the freedom and happiness of our people, and to protect the free constitutional order.
Well, within an hour, armed forces have been sent to seize the National Assembly, with helicopters landing on the roof. At the same time, lawmakers across the political spectrum forced their way in, voted to block Yoon's move. In the meantime, protesters gathering in Seoul, a standoff with the military, and demonstrators captured in a viral video showing armed soldiers trying to enter the National Assembly, and a woman standing in defiance, blocking and grabbing a soldier's gun. So this image going viral. 6 hours later, the president reverses his decision. He is now set to face an impeachment vote. So what's been happening? Nico, The Economist describing this as an attempted coup by President Yoon. What's your take?
It's just the most extraordinary thing. I can't remember seeing anything quite like it. It's kind of like he's had a breakdown on the world stage, and it's a kind of desperate cry for help somehow. It seems like he got so frustrated. He came to power and he'd been very controversial, but then when the midterms happened, he just lost control of any power whatsoever that he had, because the opposition had done so well in the midterms, and he was having his budget chipped away at. He was being blocked for everything he wanted to do. His wife was being dragged into this scandal that just seems to have bubbled on for months and months and months about whether or not she took a handbag as a gift, and it seems like he's just blown his top and had enough. I've never seen anybody. But essentially, he can't deny that it was some sort of a coup attempt, because he apparently had ordered the military to stop the lawmakers going into the Parliament building. So, I mean, it pretty much hits the exact definition of a coup, obviously having declared martial law. For him to then sort of 6 hours later say, oh, I didn't really mean it, I'm terribly sorry, it's just not going to wash. I mean, the strength of the vote in Parliament, 190-0, gives, I think, a pretty clear idea of what his prospects are looking like. And this guy is going to be getting booted out of office very soon indeed.
Vivian, it's really striking because we're getting more news from the Prime Minister, the different parties, saying that he was basically coined for arrest. It's changing his feeling about things. He definitely wants impeachment now. There's talk of treason from some within the opposition camp as well. Tell me how you're assessing this.
Well, I would say that when you're in a country where you don't have a where you actually have compulsory military service for every man in the country, it's kind of a risky thing to declare martial law. You're essentially declaring that your people are now going to be working for you and essentially enforcing the law against their fellow citizens. So I think he kind of had, as Nico said, he sort of had a public breakdown. I mean, the other thought is, we tend to think of South Korea as this kind of big democracy. It's one of the great, economies in the world. In fact, it's a very new democracy, and it's had an incredibly violent history, and for that matter, a very recently violent history. So we shouldn't be that shocked, actually.
Bozu, I want to give you the last 30 seconds before we finish the programme, because Vivian said something quite prescient there. This is still a young democracy coming from military rule back in the 80s. Were you just taken aback by what was going on? As Dave said, there's so much going on around the world, and suddenly we're in South Korea.
I was just impressed with the resilience of the South Korean people. They stood up for their democracy in a way that I'm not sure that supporters of certain presidents in the U.S., for example, would in that way. The guy is a chauvinist. He seems to be obsessed with like curtailing women's rights, and it was telling that it was a woman who stood there in front of those soldiers, preventing and grabbing their guns and not letting them destroy her democratic country.
One of the images of 2024, I think, no doubt. Thank you so much to the panel this week. Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine, Bozo Deragahi, independent international correspondent, Dave Clark, Paris correspondent to Agence France Presse, and Nico Hines, news director at the Daily Beast in London. Before you finish, just time to mention, this week has also seen the start of the Ravel exhibition here in Paris, marking 150 years since the birth of the great French composer. Legend has it, every 15 minutes there is somewhere in the world playing Bolero, one of his most famous compositions. And so, what better way to play us out than with the iconic 80s Ravelian moment, Torval and Dean earning their unprecedented all sixes for the 1984 Winter Olympics routine to Bolero that us Brits have been yawping on around for the last 40 years. Thanks for watching. See you in 7 days for the world next week.